a word that many people know because of the very recent pandemic that is still going on in the world today. An epidemic is defined as an increase, often sudden, in the number of cases of a disease above what is normally expected in that population or area. Outbreak carries the same definition of epidemic, but is often used more for a limited geographic area. When they hit, a lot of people get sick, and that is a problem. And a lot of people die, which is obviously a worse problem. But what are the ones that made the history books? Allow us to show you the top 9 worst epidemics in history. Be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Number 9, the prehistoric epidemic. About 5,000 years ago, an epidemic wiped out a prehistoric village in China. The bodies of the dead were stuffed inside a house that was later burned down. No age group was spared, as the skeletons of juveniles, young adults, and middle-aged people were found inside the house. The archaeological site is now called Hammond and is one of the best preserved prehistoric sites in northeastern China. Archaeological and anthropological study indicates that the epidemic happened quickly enough that there was no time for proper burials and the site was not inhabited again. Before that discovery, another prehistoric mass burial that dates to roughly the same time period was found at a site called Miazagao in northeastern China. Together, these discoveries suggest that an epidemic ravaged the entire region, showing that then and now, these are events that no one wants to have happen to their region, because if they do, they're devastating in all the ways that matter. Number 8, the Athens epidemic. Around 430 BC, not long after a war between Athens and Sparta began, an epidemic ravaged the people of Athens and lasted for 5 years. Some estimates put the death toll as high as 100,000 people. The Greek historian Thucydides wrote that people in good health were all of a sudden attacked by violent heats in the head and redness and inflammation in the eyes, the inward parts such as the throat or tongue, becoming bloody and emitting an unnatural and fetid breath. What exactly this epidemic was has long been a source of debate among scientists, as a number of diseases have been put forward as possibilities, including typhoid fever and Ebola. Many scholars believe that overcrowding caused by the war exacerbated the epidemic. Sparta's army was stronger, forcing the Athenians to take refuge behind a series of fortifications called the Long Walls that protected their city. Despite the epidemic, the war continued on, not ending until 404 BC, when Athens was forced to capitulate to Sparta. So in its own way, this was a much worse epidemic than others, because this was going on during a war. Ironic, no? Number 7, the Antoine epidemic. When soldiers returned to the Roman Empire from campaigning, they brought back more than the spoils of victory. The Antoine plague, which may have been smallpox, laid waste to the army and may have killed over 5 million people in the Roman Empire, wrote April Pudsey, a senior lecturer in Roman history at Manchester Metropolitan University, in a paper published in the book Disability and Antiquity Routledge 2017. Many historians believe that the epidemic was first brought into the Roman Empire by soldiers returning home after a war against Parthia. The epidemic contributed to the end of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a period of 27 BC to 180 AD, when Rome was at the height of its power. After AD 180, instability grew throughout the Roman Empire as it experienced more civil wars and invasions by barbarian groups. Christianity became increasingly popular in the time after the plague occurred. Now, this would be a thing that would translate to future generations as bringing an unknown disease from one land to another, where its native people weren't prepared for it and would cause much devastation. Number 6, Cyprian epidemic. Named after Saint Cyprian, a bishop of Carthage, a city in Tanzania, who described the epidemic as signaling the end of the world. The plague of Cyprian is estimated to have killed 5,000 people a day in Rome alone. In 2014, archaeologists in Luxor found what happens to be a mass burial site of plague victims. Their bodies were covered with a thick layer of lime, historically used as a disinfectant. Archaeologists found 3 kilns used to manufacture lime and the remains of plague victims burned in a giant bonfire. Experts aren't sure what disease caused the epidemic. The bowels relaxed into a constant flux, discharged the bodily strength, and a fire originated in the marrow ferments in the wounds of the fauces, an area of the mouth. Cyprian wrote in Latin. Number 5, the Coccolizzi epidemic. The infection that caused the epidemic was a form of viral hemorrhagic fever that killed 15 million inhabitants of Mexico and Central America. Among a population already weakened by extreme drought, the disease proved to be utterly catastrophic. Cocolitzli is the Aztec word for pest. A recent study that examined DNA from the skeletons of victims found that they were infected with a subspecies of Salmonella, which causes enteric fever, a category of fever that includes typhoid. Enteric fever can cause a high fever, dehydration, and gastrointestinal problems, and is still a major health threat today, showing that sometimes epidemics never really go away. Number 4. The American Epidemics. No, not the current one, but the ones that came from the earliest settling of the United States. The American plagues are a cluster of Eurasian diseases brought to the Americas by European explorers. These illnesses included smallpox, which contributed to the collapse of the Inca and Aztec civilizations. Some estimates suggest that 90% of the indigenous population in the Western Hemisphere was killed off. The diseases helped a Spanish force led by Hernan Cortez conquer the Aztec capital in 1519, and another Spanish force led by Francisco Pizarro conquer the Incas in 1532. The Spanish took over the territories of both empires. In both cases, the Aztec and Incan armies have been ravaged by disease and were unable to withstand the Spanish forces. When citizens of Britain, France, Portugal, and the Netherlands began exploring, conquering, and settling the Western Hemisphere, they were also helped by the fact that disease had vastly reduced the size of any indigenous groups that opposed them. Number 3. The Marseille Epidemic. Historical records say that the Great Plague of Marseille started when a ship called Grand Saint Antoine docked in Marseille, France, carrying a cargo of goods from the eastern Mediterranean. Although the ship was quarantined, plague still got into the city, likely through fleas on plague-infected rodents. Plague spread quickly, and over the next 3 years, as many as 100,000 people may have died in there and surrounding areas. It is estimated that up to 30% of the population of Marseille may have perished. Number 2. The current pandemic. Technically speaking, what is going on right now with COVID is both an epidemic and a pandemic all at the same time. Usually an epidemic is localized while a pandemic covers the whole world. That definitely applies here with COVID. Because at first it was an epidemic in China, then as people who didn't realize they had it traveled all over, it spread across the world like a wildfire, hence it being a pandemic. But when people started to learn what it was about, how it was transmitted, and more, they had a chance to limit exposure. And the people who got sick and chose not to do so most of the time, that is why so many localized areas like Florida would get massive amounts of cases versus the rest of the world. So it was an epidemic and a pandemic, and that's why over a year later, COVID is still a problem in our world. Number 1. Bubonic plague. The bubonic plague, or the Black Death as it is dramatically called, was a massive and widespread disease that hit Europe over the course of 1348 to 1351. Now, while 3 years may not sound like a long time for a disease, that is an eternity. And Europe paid the price for that longevity, as some estimates claim that 66% of Europe's population was wiped out because of this plague. And as if that wasn't bad enough, the people of Europe at that time were a bit clueless on how to counter disease of this nature, and they actually made things worse at times, including thinking that cats were the cause of the disease, so they killed them off. But cats kill rats, who were the real carriers, so it just made things worse. Thankfully for all of mankind, there hasn't been such a widespread disease since. Even the current pandemic doesn't compare to what the Black Plague did. And yet there are disturbing trends that can be tied to both of them, including blaming the wrong thing for spreading the virus. Let us know that no matter what epidemic comes in the future, it won't be as bad as the Black Death. So what do you think? What do you think of this look at the epidemics of history and how they affected many? Which ones do you think are the worst in your mind? What ones did you learn about today that you are glad you personally didn't have to live through? Is there one that could be on the horizon that you know about? Let us know in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe, and we will see you next time on the channel.